Hello, everyone. Welcome to our history, theology, philosophy lecture series. We are trying something very new this month. I am not in Center Place or in Toronto. Instead, I am in the historic city of Lyon, which has been part of France for many centuries. And so we're doing something different from our normal series. We are visiting historic locations, and we are taking the opportunity to talk about people and events in history that have some relationship to the place. In the Middle Ages, Lyon was one of the chief cities of the Kingdom of Burgundy, which was located in the middle of Western Europe between the kingdoms of France, Germany, and Italy. Next week, I'm going to talk about the history of the lost Middle Kingdom in Europe: Provence, Arles, Burgundy, Lotharingia, Lorraine, and how this lost kingdom helped shape today's Europe. And the following week, we will talk about popular religious reform movements. So we'll look at one that began here in Lyon at the end of the 12th century. There was a rich merchant here named Peter Waldo who wanted to access the Bible directly, and he commissioned a translation of the New Testament from Latin into the local language spoken by the people here. Medieval Arpitan. So Arpitan is the vernacular or common language that descended originally from Latin and is related to and exists between French, the language that developed around Paris, and Provençal, that developed further south in Provence. And so this was the very first time in the West that the Bible had been translated into a vernacular language, and reading the Gospels himself apparently inspired Waldo to follow Jesus' counsel to the rich young man. And so Waldo decided to sell all of his possessions and give to the poor, and he followed Jesus. And so many were inspired to follow Waldo, leading to the foundation of a movement called the Poor of Lyon, or the Waldensians. And so although Waldo's story shares some themes with his later contemporary Francis of Assisi, the Waldensians did not find a home within the established church the way the Franciscans did, and we'll talk about this in our lecture 2 weeks from today. Our topic today takes us back many centuries earlier in history to classical antiquity as we look at the context, life, and thought of one of our earliest important Christian writers, Irenaeus of Lyon. And we're also talking about Irenaeus' contemporaries who viewed Christian essentials in a very different way, the Gnostics and the Valentinians. So my goal in this presentation is, one, to explain Gnosticism generally, two, to look at the way Gnosticism was adapted by a brilliant second century Christian thinker named Valentinus, who synthesized the Gnostic system and had a great deal of popular appeal. And then finally, I want to look at Irenaeus and his arguments against the Gnostics and the Valentinians. Specifically, I want to look very closely at Irenaeus' book, Adversus Haereses, which is to say against heresies, which was one of the few detailed sources on Gnosticism prior to the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library in Egypt in the 20th century, which still remains an important source for understanding Gnosticism. So let's begin with a primer on Gnosticism. Our word Gnostic comes from Gnostikos, which means having knowledge in Greek. And so this emphasizes one of the movement's core focus is knowledge or gnosis. We do not have a definitive historical explanation of Gnosticism's origin because it seems to have existed side by side within many different competing religions in the 1st century AD. And so while there were many Christian Gnostics, there's also evidence that there were Jewish Gnostics who were not Christian. There were also likely Zoroastrian Gnostics. And Gnostics generally were influenced by some aspects of Zoroastrianism, which is the world religion of the contemporary Parthian Persian Empire at the time. In the 3rd century, after this time, the Parthian prophet Mani would bring much of Gnosticism into his new religious synthesis that became the world religion of Manichaeism. And in the Near Eastern world religion of Mandaism, which is unrelated to Manichaeism, it traces its origin to the movement founded by John the Baptist. Mandaism is itself Gnostic. Also thrown into the mix were the Gnostics who practiced the traditional Greco-Roman religion of the old gods, what we call paganism. In short, Gnosticism was a widespread phenomenon in antiquity, which causes some scholars to question whether this is really a thing at all, or whether we're drawing a category around multiple different things that share some ideas and are simply being given the label Gnostic. Some of the ideas of Gnosticism are rooted in a key debate that took place among the earliest Greek philosophers. Philosophers questioned the inherited myths and practices, the religious myths of the ancient world, and they developed tools like logic, reason, and argument in order to come to more rational explanations for how the universe came into being, how it operates, and to explain the role of humans within it. Among the great thinkers before Socrates, Heraclitus and Parmenides composed opposite arguments for the nature of existence. Heraclitus is famous for saying, "It's not possible to step into the same river twice because the water is ever flowing and changing. It may look the same, but it isn't. Therefore, nothing is permanent. Everything is in a constant state of flux." Parmenides, by contrast, argued the opposite. Everything, he said, seems to change, but it doesn't really, because things either exist or they don't. Parmenides focuses his ideas on what it means to be, what it means to exist. This is the origin of ontology, one of the central ideas in philosophy, the study of being, ontology. And so Parmenides' ideas about being and change directly influenced Socrates and Plato. So Plato's theories of the forms is a powerful response to this challenge. Agreeing with Parmenides, Plato sees unchanging ideals as being or as existing in a very real sense. And so these eternal ideals or forms are everything from mathematical principles to more abstract virtues like love, courage, and wisdom. But Plato also has an explanation for Heraclitus's flux, this river that is not the same 1 minute to the next. The river, and indeed all sensible matter, sensible in the sense that we can sense it, not in the sense that it makes sense. The river and sensible matter are part of the perishable world. Everything that we can sense, everything that we can touch and feel is material and subject to decay, and is therefore temporary and perishable. All of this is in direct contrast with the imperishable world, which Plato says can only be perceived using our intellect rather than our senses. And thus it's called the intellectible world as opposed to the sensible world. And for Plato, the relationship with these two worlds is very stark indeed. Even though it can't be sensed, the imperishable world of the forms is actually the true reality. And the perishable material world that we sense is, by contrast, just a mere faint shadow of that real world. Plato was among the most influential thinkers of all times, and his ideas are foundational to Gnosticism, which similarly divides the world into two, privileging the imperishable, the immaterial realm of light and spirit, while denigrating the physical, perishable world that we inhabit. Not simply as a shadow, as Plato would have it, but as a prison and even as a cosmic mistake. So in his own works, Plato understood the value of myth or narrative as a teaching tool. For example, in addition to teaching through allegories like the cave, by which Plato attempted to contrast this material world as a dim shadow of the real imperishable world of the forms that exist outside the cave, or in his idealized republic, which is less a blueprint for a practical utopia and is more an allegory for human thought. So in addition to these allegorical teachings, Plato also created myths. These include the myth of the Ring of Gyges, which is a precursor of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, where you can put the ring on and turn invisible. And also the very famous myth of Atlantis, which people are still trying to find, and as if there's a real Atlantis, even though Atlantis is a myth that Plato created out of nothing in order to teach a lesson. So Plato understood the value of myths as a teaching tool. The Gnostics took myth-making a great deal further. They actually agreed with Platonists that the true world is a spiritual realm, with an eternal form, the One, that is the source of all of the other forms, and ultimately by emanations, their material shadows. How did this state of affairs come to be? The Gnostics give their answer in the form of elaborate cosmogonies. That is to say, creation myths, like the myths at the beginning of the book of Genesis in the Hebrew Bible, but Genesis is much simpler. Because of the diversity in Gnosticism, there never was anything like a single Gnostic church. There are multiple creation stories that vary significantly in their details. So one Christian version of the Gnostic cosmogony is found in the Apocryphon of John. Apocryphon means secret book or secret revelation. And the John in question here is meant to be the Apostle John, the disciple of Jesus. In previous lectures, we've looked at the reason why biblical scholars reject the idea that the Apostle John wrote the gospel attributed to him in the New Testament or any of the other Johannine literature. And we can also say that the secret book of John is pseudepigraphic. And so it's likely a mid-2nd century text. As we'll see, Irenaeus of Lyon had a copy of this book, and he quotes from it in his refutation of Gnosticism. But since his time, the bulk of the text was lost until a copy was discovered in the Nag Hammadi Library in 1945. So at the beginning of the text, we read that, quote, "One day John, the brother of James, the sons of Zebedee, was going up to the temple in Jerusalem. A Pharisee by the name of Monad came to him and challenged him, asking, "Where is that teacher you used to follow?" John replied, "He has gone back to the place from which he came." The Pharisee said, "The Nazarene misled you all. He told you lies and closed your hearts and turned you away from your ancestral traditions." This challenge caused John, in this text, discomfort. Retiring to a deserted mountain retreat, he asked himself, quote, "How was the Savior designated? Why did his Father send him into the world? Who is his Father? What kind of realm will we go to?" In short, the apostle realizes he still has many unsettled meaning of life kind of questions, because although he remembers that Jesus had taught his disciples, quote, "This realm is modeled on the perishable realm," Jesus didn't give any of the details. So the idea that the material world is modeled on the imperishable realm, that's not actually a quotation of any of Jesus' sayings in the canonical Gospels, but it is perfectly aligned with Plato's teachings about the forms. So these questions in the Apocryphon result in John receiving a vision. The heaven opened before him, the world quakes. He looks and he sees, quote, "a little child appearing before him in light. And I continued looking at him as he became an old man. And he changed again, becoming like a young man." Essentially, this is a precursor of the vision of the star child in 2001: A Space Odyssey. So this being identifies themselves: "I am the Father, the Mother, I am the Son. I am the incorruptible purity." This divine messenger shares with John the secret origin of reality, which begins with the One. So in Greek, this word is the monad. The One, he explains, quote, "rules all. Nothing has authority over it. It is the God. It is the Father of everything. Moreover, we are told, quote, "The One is the invisible Spirit. It is not right to think of it as a God or as like God. It is more than just God." So many of the monad's qualities are similar to the more mainline Christian understanding of God. The One is perfect and is, quote, "life producing light, knowledge producing knowledge, good producing goodness, mercy producing mercy," and so forth. But in contrast to the mainline view, all of reality is within the monad. For we read in this book that the One is without boundaries, nothing exists outside of its borders, and since everything exists within it, the One does not exist within anything at all. So in traditional Christianity, God, the Creator, exists outside of creation. So creation isn't inside God. So in the text, all reality, true reality, emanates from the One. At the beginning, the monad thought, and thus thought, his self-aware thought, providence, came into being. This first emanation, or aeon, kind of divine being, is named the Barbelo, and it is called in the text, quote, "she who is before everything, the Mother Father, the universal womb." After this first aeon, a whole series of aeons are put forth in different phases and realms, filling out divine reality. These include the aeons of God's Word, which is Christ, and is here given the epithet of the autogenes, or the self-born one. And then the final emanations occur within the, quote, fourth light that is called Eleleth, and it stands over the fourth realm, and within Eleleth are the aeons of perfection, grace, and wisdom. And so wisdom, Sophia, holy wisdom in Greek, is the final aeon. There are many more details than that, and you can study that for years if you like, if that's the kind of thing you like to do. Certainly the Gnostics seem to have loved that kind of thing. But the shorthand here is that we have immaterial ideals like peace and grace and wisdom that are understood in the Gnostic myth as aeons, but very much resembling Plato's forms. But we have added here a narrative how the forms came to be, along with all of this elaborate cosmography, a divine realm known as the pleroma, or fullness of the power of the One. The Apocryphon of John also explains how this material world came into being. So we read that, quote, "It happened that the aeon, Sophia, holy wisdom, began to think for herself. She intended to reveal an image from herself, and to do so without the consent of the Spirit, which did not approve, and without the thoughtful assistance of her masculine counterpart, who did not approve." And so the aeons up until this point have been operating in gendered pairs in a kind of cosmic androgyny. But wisdom, her desire to act alone creates division. And so that brings forth a new being, all on her own, which is described as misshapen and unlike herself. And wisdom names this being Yaldabaoth. Yaldabaoth takes great power from his mother, and then, thinking of himself like a god, he begins to mimic the creation process as had been enacted by the superior aeons. And so he creates for himself a whole series of subordinate demons. Yaldabaoth's work results in the creation of a material world that is fundamentally inferior to the true spiritual realm, but is nevertheless animated by light that Yaldabaoth has stolen from his mother, Sophia. So after all of this, Sophia repents her mistake, and she and the other aeons make plans to try to thwart Yaldabaoth and to recover the lost sparks of light that are inhabiting his flawed creation. They trick him, for example, into creating Adam and to putting some of that light essence into Adam. And so we read that, quote, "Yaldabaoth said to his supporting demons, 'Let's create man according to the image of God, and in our own likeness, so that his image will illuminate us.'" So you can sort of hear in there that this is a reworking of the Genesis creation myth. And from this point on in the text, it becomes very clear that the God of the Old Testament in this retelling it's not God at all. The God of the Old Testament is Yaldabaoth, the flawed, misbegotten being descendant of Sophia. In another traditional, reversal of the traditional text, Christ reveals to the Apostle John that it was actually he himself, the aeon of God's word, that caused Adam to eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge. Of course, that's not how the story goes in Genesis, and when John hears this admission, he's confused. He asks the Savior, "Lord, wasn't it the serpent that caused Adam to eat?" But knowledge for the Gnostics cannot be the problem. The tree, the forbidden fruit in Eden, the tree of knowledge, is actually now shown to be the penetration of Christ and the spiritual aeons into Yaldabaoth's flawed material creation. For Gnostics, sin is equated with ignorance. And so Christ's salvific role is to bring true knowledge. As soon as you understand that this material world is an illusion, and that your true spiritual being isn't about division, it's ultimately about oneness with the one true source, the monad, the sooner you will have achieved enlightenment, which is true salvation. From the time of the Apostle Paul onwards, that is, almost from the outset itself, early Christianity rapidly spread to the Greek-speaking pagan Roman world. Two factors aided in winning converts. First, Paul and his school of apostles successfully argued that Christians should not observe Jewish law. Dietary restrictions and the requirement that men be circumcised were significant barriers to entry that Pauline Christians eliminated. But a second factor is equally relevant. Christian theology from the start was a synthesis of Second Temple Judaism along with Greek philosophy. Second Temple Judaism had, in fact, already been affected by Hellenism for many centuries. An active question in the first century was where Christianity should set the balance. So Jewish Christians and churches that looked to the authority of James, Jesus' brother, continued to observe Jewish law, insisting that the scale be weighed heavily against Greek ideas and in favor of the religion's Jewish foundations. Gnostic Christians pushed hard in the other direction. As we've seen in the Apocryphon of John, the Gnostic creation myth owes a lot to Plato, who is revered, while it simultaneously denigrates and subverts the narrative of the Hebrew Bible, whose God is exposed as an unfaithful narrator, the low god Yaldabaoth. Purging Christianity of its Jewish roots was also the program of Marcion of Sinope, an influential Christian theologian who lived at the end of the first century and the beginning of the second. In crafting what is sometimes credited as the first proposed canon of the Christian Bible, Marcion deleted the entire Old Testament and more than half of the books that eventually made it into the New Testament. For him, only Paul's letters and an edited version of Luke's gospel should be considered scriptures. Like the Gnostics, Marcion denounced the God of the Hebrew Bible as false, but he did not adopt the rest of the Gnostic cosmology. So in other words, there's no elaborate series of aeons for him. The problem with excising the Hebrew Bible from Christianity is that Jesus himself is fully rooted in the tradition. If a successful variant of Christianity had simply launched from Paul's foundation, this might have been a possibility. Paul's faith is focused on the risen Christ, and he spends little time quoting Jesus' teachings. But even if the foundation were just Paul, it's difficult to escape the religion's Jewish roots. Paul was himself Jewish, and he does quote the Hebrew Bible a great deal. However, once the Gospels were written, long after Paul, the Gospels, with their focus on Jesus and his teachings, it just seems less realistic to imagine that the religion could follow Marcion in his total rejection of its Jewish roots. Indeed, by the end of the first century, most Christians followed a middle path that synthesized the religion's Greek and Jewish roots. This is the context in which Valentinus came on the scene. Valentinus was a brilliant second century Christian theologian who lived around the year 100, born around 100, and lived till about 180. He received education in Greek at the great cosmopolitan center of Alexandria, which was also the center of Gnosticism. Clement of Alexandria says that Valentinus was a student of the Gnostic Christian teacher Thuaetus, who in turn was supposedly a disciple of Paul. Valentinus moved to Rome around the year 136 and became a candidate considered for the role of Bishop of Rome. Passed over, he nevertheless founded an influential theological school where he elaborated his theological ideas. By his day, the Gospels and other early Christian texts were becoming more central and authoritative within the religion. It was going to be much less easy to ignore and exclude them from consideration. So if we think of Christianity as a spectrum between its twin foundations of Judaism on the right and Greek philosophy on the left, Gnosticism was originally way out in left field. Valentinus' great project was to redefine the Gnostic myth and bring Gnosticism more into harmony with the scriptures and with Christian practice. So, Valentinus' work slimmed down the previous Gnostic myths, made them more relatable, and he frequently replaced weird technical terms and Greek philosophical jargon with more immediately accessible ideas and imagery drawn from the scriptures. He also made Gnosticism less confrontational with Christian tradition and practice. So whereas Gnostics previously had decried the Christian sacrament or the rite of the Eucharist as a false sacrifice of dark material to a false god, Valentinus said, no. This is a practice we can justify as an important symbolic teaching. Consuming symbols representing the Savior's body and blood here are an allegory to consuming true knowledge, which is necessary for salvation. And so, although Valentinus failed in his bid to become pope, to the extent that there were popes in the 2nd century, his works became very influential, making Valentinian Gnosticism a more acceptable middle path option for his Christian audience. It was just the success that irked Irenaeus of Lyon. Irenaeus was a contemporary of Valentinus, born a generation later, around the year 130, and living until around 202 AD. Irenaeus was born in the Greek-speaking city of Smyrna on the west coast of Asia Minor, a region where Paul had been actively planting churches in the previous century. Smyrna is listed among the 7 churches of Asia referenced by John the Baptist in the book of Revelation. Polycarp, who was an early bishop of Smyrna, is among our earliest Christian writers. Polycarp, for example, penned an epistle to the Philippians, which survived. And additionally, another early Christian writer, Ignatius of Antioch, wrote an epistle to Polycarp that survives, along with another general epistle to the Smyrnians. So early on, Irenaeus immigrated here to Gaul, following in the footsteps of another leader named Pothinus, who also came from Smyrna. So in the 1st and 2nd centuries, Lyon, then called Lugdunum, was the capital of Roman Gaul. The empire was focused on the Mediterranean, and the Rhone River is one of the few navigable rivers that reach into the north, making Lyon a perfect site for administration and commerce. The city was wealthy and relatively cosmopolitan, with a mixed population of Gauls and Latins. Greeks, Syrians, and Jews. Pothinus helped organize an early Christian community here, which became one of the first in the Latin West outside of Rome itself, and he became the city's first bishop. Irenaeus followed him west and became a priest, serving under Pothinus' leadership. Later, when Pothinus was killed by the Roman government during a significant persecution held locally in which 48 Christians were executed in total, Irenaeus succeeded Pothinus as the second bishop of Lugdunum, Lyon. So Ignatius, Polycarp, Pothinus, and Irenaeus were all bishops, and they all represented this transition from early Christianity with its earliest beginnings when mendicant apostles and prophets traveled between cities, preaching by the Spirit, planting church communities. And now, decades later, it had developed a more settled Christianity focused on bishops who oversaw established churches. The bishops were all effectively autonomous. Effective church hierarchy would not really exist until after the conversion of Constantine, but some of the diversity of the earliest Christianities was already on the wane as bishops wrote each other letters and tried to have some consensus over issues of orthodoxy and orthopraxy. That is to say, what are the proper teachings and the proper practices of the church? On the spectrum, proto-orthodox leaders staked out a position that against the Ebionites, in other words to say, a group that would have preferred that Christianity remain a sect of Judaism, and the Gnostics and the Marcionites who would have preferred to reject this the religion's Jewish roots. The early Orthodox leaders also rejected Gnosticism, but they lacked the tools that were later available to them to attack ideas that were considered heretical. So it's not until Constantine called the first ecumenical council in the year 325 and gathered a whole host of bishops together to define what orthodoxy is and to craft a statement of belief, the Nicene Creed. That council became a forum that defined ideas like Arianism to be a heresy, and it also condemned its proponent Arius as a heretic. But Irenaeus here in Lyon, couple centuries before Nicaea, at that point, each bishop's direct authority really only covered his own church. And beyond that, it was largely necessary to persuade others through writing. And part of the trouble, to Irenaeus' thinking anyway, was that Valentinus had been too persuasive. He had converted large numbers of Christians to his kind of reformed Gnostic perspective. Irenaeus therefore set out to counter these arguments in a text that is formally titled, quote, Detection and Overthrow of the So-Called Gnosis, but it's more generally known by its Latin title, Adversus Haereses, which is to say, against heresies. In his preface, Irenaeus complains that, quote, certain men have set the truth aside and have drawn away the minds of the inexperienced by means of their craftily constructed plausibilities. This is kind of a backhanded compliment. He's admitting that the arguments put forward by Valentinus and his disciples are well constructed and sound plausible. At the heart of Irenaeus' complaints is, quote, they gather their views from other sources than the scriptures. In other words, the core ideas of the Gnostic myth have non-biblical origins. They're coming from Plato or other Gnostic sources. But then, Valentinus anyway, and his disciples, quote, endeavor to adapt with an air of probability to their own peculiar assertions, the parables of the Lord, the sayings of the prophets, and the words of the apostles, in order that their scheme may not seem altogether without support, unquote. So, in his attempt to bring Gnosticism into greater alignment with the scriptures, Valentinus has replaced earlier Gnostic terms with words drawn from the scriptures, and he's also cited scriptures to back up his Gnostic ideas. Irenaeus argues, however, that this deliberately distorts the original intent of the scriptures, which were not written with Gnosticism in mind. And he may have a strong point here. While scholars of Gnosticism, like Elaine Pagels, have argued that some canonical texts, including parts of Paul and the Gospel of John, for example, can be read as proto-Gnostic, much of the rest of the New Testament canon is not proto-Gnostic. And so, of course, Irenaeus and the other proto-orthodox leaders were intentionally stacking that deck. We're still centuries away from a finalized list of which texts would become canonical as the New Testament. Valentinus was likely drawing on texts like the Gospel of Thomas, a gospel that includes many proto-Gnostic teachings. But Irenaeus and his fellow bishops excluded Thomas from the canon for that reason. In other words, because the text has proto-Gnostic ideas, and so that's enough of a reason to leave it out of the canon. In fact, in basing his argument on the idea of consistency with Scripture, Irenaeus himself is one of the first early Christians who is actively assembling and quoting from the bulk of what became the New Testament canon. He is among the first Christians to insist that all four Gospels that eventually made it into the New Testament should be seen as canonical. But all the other ones should not be seen as canonical. And indeed, he's one of the first who argues you need to use all four and not just your favorite Gospel, the way earlier Christian communities had traditionally done it. Beyond the Gospels, Irenaeus quotes from at least 17 and maybe 20 of the other 24 texts that eventually made it into the New Testament. He is thus also one of the earliest Christian writers to ground his theology in a synthesis of scriptures. If persuasion was all that Irenaeus had in his tool bag, he was actually pretty good at deploying it, although with rhetorical humility he claims that, quote, as someone living among the Celts here in Gaul, and accustomed as he is to using a barbarous dialogue, he says, thus you should not expect from me any display of rhetoric, which I have never learned, nor any excellence of composition, which I have never practiced, nor any beauty or persuasiveness of style to which I make no pretension. So in other words, he uses this incredible rhetoric and his skill in order to claim that he's not rhetorically trained. Nevertheless, he's able to use rhetoric in the course of his long book in order to point out problems with Gnosticism that end up being persuasive. So for example, he sees that seeing the God of the Old Testament and the material creator as being separate from the God of the New Testament, the God of the imperishable realm, that's a problem. So Marcion, he says, by dividing God into two, by maintaining one God to be good and the other God to be judicial, in other words, one is concerned with goodness, the other is concerned with justice. Marcion, in fact, on both sides, puts an end to true deity, that is, deity with a capital D or God with a capital G. There's more than one God here. We've abandoned monotheism. Okay, so Irenaeus continues, for that God, that is the judicial one, if he be not good, is not God. Because he who from goodness is absent is no God. So this God of the Old Testament is merely judicial. He's no God at all. And again, he says, he who is good, if he have no judicial power, suffers the same loss as the former God, that being deprived of his character of deity. So in other words, this good God who doesn't really rule over our world also doesn't qualify as God, since there's a different God who has power over this world. So when Irenaeus points out, quote, Plato has proved to be more religious than these guys, for he allows that the same God is both just and good, having power over all things, and self-executing in his judgment. So he quotes Plato to show that the world's creator is good and not evil, as is true in the Gnostic and Valentinian conception. So Irenaeus viewed the world as imperfect but good, something that needs to be redeemed. And of course, that seems more optimistic than the Gnostic vision, which is that the world is something that needs to be escaped. Another strong argument against Valentinus is his view of humanity, and that it's elitist. So drawing on ideas about the nature of existence that are found in Paul. So in other words, Valentinus lays out that there's a hierarchy of existence. So at the base is matter, the flesh. Above that is the soul, and the highest of all is the spirit. But Valentinus goes on to teach that humans also fall into these three categories. So some humans are simply composed of base matter alone and are thus irredeemable. A higher group are the ensouled, who can be strengthened through faith and works. But it's really only the highest group who are the spirituals, who can themselves not decay or be desecrated by this material world. And it's this last group who possess the spiritual gnosis shared by Valentinus and his disciple. In other words, these are those who are going to obtain salvation and escape from this horrible material world. So Gnosticism among Christians went into decline after Irenaeus. Unlike with later alternate takes on Christianity that were condemned as heresies and were rooted out by official persecution, persuasion seems to have been one of the major tools, as Irenaeus and his allies made a pretty good case. Perhaps even more importantly, Valentinus' school did not survive, and Gnosticism failed to keep attracting great intellects like his or of his caliber to keep the argument going. Ultimately, after the conversion of Constantine and the establishment of a state-sponsored church, Gnosticism did become officially persecuted, but not too much was left. And so there were some Christian monks in Egypt who may have still been interested in Gnostic ideas. And then acting in response to a letter from their patriarch that condemned the use of non-canonical books, these monks took their library of Gnostic-related texts and they buried them in the desert at Nag Hammadi. They might have intended to retrieve them when the official oversight kind of relented. Instead, they were buried and preserved until our own time. Meanwhile, although Gnosticism effectively died out in ancient Christianity, it did continue in other world religions like Mandaism and Manichaeism, and even resurfaced in the medieval West in the alternative Christian theologies of the Bogomils and the Cathars. And of course, the ideas continue today in neo-Gnostic revivals. And thus, while the topic of our lecture has been Irenaeus and the fall of Gnosticism, there has nevertheless been a large legacy and also some revivals. Thank you. Hello, good evening. Hi from Lyon. Very excited that we were able to debut this new format. Hopefully, everyone's hearing me just fine. Very happy to join you all. We'll start, as always, by thanking everybody who gave support. So, thanks to JM, thanks to Dave Anderson, Rowan Wagner, JH, and Daryl Scott. We had a lot of love for this format that we're debuting. A lot of love for Mike's incredibly steady cam hand as he's walking backwards, and as we're seeing the old city of Lyon. We do have a few questions. Gnostic Informant is on. Great to see you, Gnostic Informant. Loved being on your podcast before. Gnostic Informant asks, I wonder if Antiochus of Ascalon could be considered proto-Gnostic or Gnostic, an early Gnostic. So Antiochus is a philosopher and a Middle Platonist, and is existing before, a little bit before we start having a lot of evidence of full-on Gnostic myth and Gnostic writings. But I think anyway that Platonism, Middle Platonism, is very clearly a precursor. It's part of the foundation of Gnosticism. So I think that it's very possible that works people like Antiochus, people who are popularizing Platonism, could have helped bring that to a broader audience that the Gnostics then brought to a bigger audience even. Nathan Gale writes, what do you think are the teachings of Gnostic Christians that could be reintroduced into modern Christianity without getting excommunicated? Do you have a Gnostic teaching that you really like much? So, in terms of getting excommunicated, it depends on what church you belong to. So you could get excommunicated, I think, easier in a bunch of churches than others. Ours is pretty hard to get excommunicated from, especially over topics of heresy. And I know that we have lots of people who are very interested in Gnosticism as a kind of, especially Gnosticism as an approach to mysticism and how you are becoming one with God through the mystical path. And so I think that within our tradition, my church, that there's plenty of people that are maintaining or who have, done reading into Gnosticism and find things that they are attuned to. I think that it makes a lot of sense personally to recover more of Christianity's ancient texts. So I've said before that I think that Christianity should really bring, a lot more into, when we do actually in my church again, the Gospel of Thomas is such an important early text. And the version that we have from Nag Hammadi is definitely includes lots of proto-Gnostic teachings. And there are other more full-on Gnostic Gospels that have been recovered that are also really interesting. And so I think more of that could be brought into, contemporary Christianity without too much danger. As I said, I sort of, I am partial to Plato and Platonism. And so that component of it, I really like. When I was, I think when I was younger, I was much more interested in elaborate angelologies, learning all of the different names of all the angels that different apocryphal, pseudepigraphal books made. So these kind of elaborate myths and stories, allegories were more interesting to me than they are at present. So I'm not as excited about the Gnostic myth nowadays. So I gave it to you in a nutshell instead of doing an even deeper dive. But I think that, again, there's a lot to be revived and to go back and look at in the present. Anderson, thank you so much for your support. Dalai Lama, thank you for your support. The Dalai Lama says that this is just groovy and loves it. Thank you. Josh Bedford asks, do you think there is a Gnostic element to our internet age? That is to say that we have online communities, we work from home, we replace physical incarnate gathering with these online ways of meeting everybody. And so I am connecting to all of you in this very virtual way, even though we're doing this in real time. And so Mike and Leandro and I have stayed up late since we're here in France, and who knows what time it is where all of you are in. I mean, Anderson Tan, who's in Singapore. It's, in other words, we're on all kinds of time zones here. I don't know. OF wrote a counter argument that the internet age is actually opposite of Gnostic because so much sifting has to be done through the information. So I think that Josh Bedford's point is that, this that making the non-physical more real, so these kind of ethereal virtual connections are more important to us than doing things in person anymore. We have maybe more friends that are not living locally that we're getting together with. We're getting together with maybe people getting together playing video games or other ways where they're connecting online or virtually as opposed to in person. OF's point, though, is that so in other words, the virtual aspect. I think OF's point is that if we think of Gnosticism instead as a focus on wisdom, the glut of information on the internet, so much of which has no wisdom to it, is the opposite of Gnostic. So I guess it depends on what you're taking as the emphasis, or what's the core idea of Gnosticism. So you could make a couple arguments there. Shun M asks, a bit off topic, is Mark 13 a failed prophecy? So Mark 13 is where the author of that gospel is talking about apocalyptically and is predicting an immediate apocalypse. And part of that is a revision of Daniel, where Daniel had predicted that a cosmic figure called the Son of Man would appear in the clouds, and that would be heralding a literal apocalypse, a literal end to the world. And as a literal prophecy in Daniel, that failed because it should have happened in the 100s BCE. So the author of Mark, who loved that book and who was living a century or so later, updated the prophecy and thought it was going to take place in the 70s AD, the 70s of the Common Era. And so to your question, Shun, it failed in the sense of any kind of literal interpretation. That generation did pass away, very literally, and the Son of Man did not cosmically come in the clouds. And so with all of kind of failed literal prophecy, people have to reassess their commitment to scriptural literalism. Literalism, it turns out, is a flawed way of looking at scripture. OF says, is the end times when God runs out of souls? Well, so if we're going to take the Bible literally here again, God has said that, or Jesus has said that nobody but the Father knows when the end times are exactly going to happen. And so let me put the microphone here so that people can hear me better. Can you hear that a little bit better? So you'll have to tell me yes or no if that is working. So anyway, and God says, or Jesus says anyway, that only the Father knows. So if there is some kind of a whole literal bank of souls up there that is being drawn down, and a reservoir that is being emptied, anybody who is up there looking at the reservoir would know when the end times would happen. And so it can't be happening literally anyway. That's my impression of that, your comment, I think, which is a little tongue-in-cheek as well. So Fastball Flake says, besides this lecture, what has been the highlight of this trip so far? Well, so in addition to the lecture, we we filmed a bunch of our Sunday service, um, and I filmed it all around the Roman ruins of the old city of Lugdunum, and so Old Lyon has two large theaters that are in ruins that we went to. And Mike and I got there really early on a Saturday morning, and essentially no one was there. And so we walked all the way around, and it was amazing to be in, just an incredible tourist location, but having the whole place to ourselves. And so that was even better than walking around the old city. I was in the old city here. We were dodging a lot of delivery trucks and cars, and there were more people there than there were when we filmed for the Sunday sermon. Ted Gemberling says, so do you belong to the peripatetic school, giving lectures on walks? I think I was breathing heavily enough that I'm not a perfect peripatetic scholar, but I do always love. I'm also very partial to Aristotle and his school of walking around, and so yeah, I'm going to continue to do this. People have mentioned that in addition to doing a lecture in this format, like when I happen to be in Europe, that there's actually lots of wonderful venues in the city of Toronto where I could also be walking around and doing this format. So we'll get a sense from people how much they prefer this or the other way that we do the lectures, and we'll shake it up even when we're in Toronto. So I'll continue to be peripatetic. Stephen Hermanson says, what would Irenaeus think about Mormons? Well, if there had been a lot of Mormons, then Irenaeus would also have included him in his book against heresies. He doesn't like all of the different groups that are not proto-orthodox, so he is interested in, he thinks that the way to understand Christianity that is in consonance with tradition. So he thinks that all of the different bishoprics have all preserved more or less the same tradition, which he believes goes back to the early church and the apostles. He also has the scriptures that he considers to be canonical, and he wants it to be consonant with that. And so he has an idea, for example, about the nature of God, the Father, and God the Father's relationship with Christ, the Logos, that would be very different from the Mormon doctrine of about how the Godhead works. And so I think Irenaeus would have, written a couple paragraphs in there condemning Mormons. James Ferguson, thank you for your support. William says, with the demiurge controlling almost all Christian souls, no wonder most of them merely think of us Gnostics are merely heretics. Yes. so yeah, from the Gnostic perspectives, you can easily understand why all the other Irenaeus and all the other Christians identify Gnosticism as a heresy. And that can be justified, like you say, for you who are Gnostics within your worldview also. So both sides can use that term. So heresy is a matter of perspective. So from Irenaeus's perspective, Valentinus is a heretic. From Valentinus' perspective, Irenaeus is a heretic. From the Mormon perspective in Salt Lake, everybody's a heretic other than them, and so on. So Daryl Scott says, aside from his anti-Gnostic work, did Irenaeus write or do anything else especially interesting? So he is very interesting, kind of like I mentioned in this lecture, in that he is a very early proponent of kind of bringing a New Testament together. So using lots of books that will ultimately become the New Testament, arguing on behalf of having 4 canonical gospels. And then, yes, he also was a theologian, and he wrote his own theology, his own understanding of Christianity that is getting us towards understanding the Trinity and the way it is developing. But unfortunately, his other works don't all survive. So what we have is his 5 books against the heresies, but we don't have all the rest. And apparently, it might be because he has a different sort of literalistic view of an apocalypse, of an end times. He's still maybe expecting that, and so because that is out of keeping with a couple centuries later Christianity, they don't preserve his other books. And so, yeah, unfortunately, we don't have the rest of it because he's a really good writer. I found I hadn't read through his Against Heresies all the way before, but I found it to be very interesting. Josh Bedford says, wasn't Gnosticism also a pre-Christian tradition that integrated with Christianity, or was Gnosticism a creature of the Christian tradition? No, yeah, Josh, like I said at the beginning of this, it's not simply Christian. So it's a phenomenon that exists outside of Christianity. So we have Jewish Gnostics who were not Christian. We have Zoroastrian Gnostics. We have Gnosticism that exists in other world religions like Mandaeism and Manichaeism later, and also there were Greco-Roman pagan Gnostics. And so it isn't a Christian tradition only, or a creature of Christianity. And actually, as I kind of go through it, I kind of also feel like it. I feel like I was sort of persuaded by Irenaeus that that some of the tradition doesn't fit, as easily with Christianity. So I think that it actually is kind of attempting to take Christianity on a little bit of a detour, in the sense that it was already doing its own thing. It became connected with Christianity and said, "Hey, well, this is sort of compatible. Why don't you guys all understand your religion in the light of how we understand the cosmos?" But it's in a sense, it's also its own thing, not just a Christian thing. Normative says there's some debate about whether various pseudepigraphic early Christian texts, both canonical and extra-canonical, are directed against Gnostics. Anywhere you find that plausible. So yeah, that's completely. It's plausible. One of the things we might say is, if we have that really earliest Christian writing, the stuff that becomes scripture, if we have that actually kind of referencing, if some of the references that it has there are to Gnosticism, then that is actually making the argument that Gnosticism within Christianity was present very, very early. And so that's an interesting argument. So I know that Elaine Pagels would like to have like the Gnostic component within Christianity to be, there at a much more formative stage than some Christian biblical scholars, other Christian biblical scholars think. And so I think that if that exists in Christian texts that made it into the Bible, if what they're actually, when they're talking about enemies, if some of those enemies are Gnostic, then that would imply that the Gnostics are there early. Mary Magnuson says, shouldn't we just all be looking for truth, whatever it is? For me, it involves correlating documentable history with our faith. Well, very interesting. Yeah. So yeah, I think that so in my particular church, in my tradition, we have an unofficial motto that is called truth. We say truth wherever it is found. That is to say, we uphold truth wherever we find it. And so that would be totally in keeping with what you're saying. So in terms of a focus on documentable history with our faith, so I think that's one approach. Certainly, I think that another place that you find truth is within would be within a theological framework or a philosophical framework, an ethical framework, a moral framework. So history and historicity isn't the only framework. It's certainly a framework that I approach a lot of knowledge from, since my training is as a historian. But I would say that that's not the only place where truth is found. In some ways, history is only a discipline that tells us what might have happened, and just because something happened doesn't make it meaningfully true. It might mean that it's true in the sense that it happened, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything. And so I think in religion, we're also looking for meaning. Barry Burton says, so are teachings that some would call speculative basically grounds they would use for declaring a teacher a Gnostic? Um, I don't know about that. So in terms of speculative, I actually think that the declaration of when you're calling somebody a Gnostic, certainly in antiquity, the Gnostics had a very particular, set of texts. They had a very particular cosmogony. They have an idea of how the universe works, and um, so maybe you're saying that that's a speculative idea, but it's not the only kind of speculative idea you would have. So you wouldn't just use the word Gnostic to call somebody, when you're actually attacking somebody for being speculative. If you're going to accuse someone of Gnosticism, they probably have, a very particular set of a worldview. Imran Makani says, was Marcion's Christology influenced by Gnosticism? So Marcion rejects all of that, all of the elaborate Gnostic myth, the Gnostic creation, all of the emanations, all of the aeons. But there are a couple things that do overlap. And so on the one hand, like I say, Marcion, I think, is trying to push the balance over to being a more Greek and more philosophical Christianity, and definitely a less Jewish Christianity. Marcion is on the Docetist side, so he's more interested in saying that in a kind of there's a good spiritual God and there's an evil physical God, and Christ is the son of the God of the New Testament, who is the true spiritual God, and so therefore he only seemed to be physical. And so I think that is similar to the Gnostics, and so they might have had some overlapping arguments, but it's also significantly different. And so it's interesting, all of the variety of early Christianities. I mean, there are also there are similarities on the other side. There are nuances within the proto-orthodox community. Like I say, Irenaeus ultimately has a little bit of nuance that he gets in trouble for, in the same way that we saw that Origen, in retrospect, people got upset with him for some nuance, and so you could get canceled for those kind of things. So in the same way, Marcion, and Valentinus don't agree on lots of things, but they agree on some things. Well, all right. This was a lot of fun. Oh, I'm excited. Mike and Leandro and I are excited to be here in France. We're going to have another couple lectures from Lyon in the upcoming weeks. So you'll have to tell us what you think of this format. Thank you to everybody who hit the like button. We did pass 100 likes while we were live. That always boosts our visibility, and YouTube suggests it to more viewers. So thank you so much for helping our channel to grow. Don't forget to like and share and subscribe to the video, and we will I'll wave and say goodbye. And thanks again.